Cavan Stone is going to tell us a little bit about Actinium-225.
I'm a grad student dropout, dropped out to get a career in energy, believe it or not. I've been interested in thorium since I was in grad school, which was 3 years ago, grad school in physics. This is a wood carving from Punch magazine, which was a news magazine in London during 1853. During that time, the Thames River was very, very heavily polluted, raw sewage, and in fact, as some of our friends from Britain may know, Parliament was actually shut down because of the stench coming off of the Thames. And so what they had was this wood carving, because this physicist, Michael Faraday, got involved with this of how to clean up the Thames. And hence there's this wood carving of Michael Faraday giving his car to Father Thames. So let me first say that I think we've covered that thorium energy can dominate the world energy market. I'm gonna save some time here and just reference Robert Hargrave's book. It's not just cheaper than coal, it's cheaper than natural gas, even at current price levels in the United States. The thorium community has to be careful because if you get stakeholders to commit to thorium energy on a Pollyanna plan that's overly optimistic, down the road there is a severe risk of alienation. And the case I would actually like to cite is the superconducting super collider. Yeah, it's actually very painful in my heart what happened to this. Some of which is I have to say, the fault of the people who were managing it. And the reason was, in 1987, the cost estimate was $4.4 billion. When we got to 1993, that more than tripled. And then a few months later, the project was canceled by Congress after $2 billion. This is the risk that I want to discourage people from doing. I would say we need to acknowledge the challenges that thorium energy faces, particularly in the United States. 10% of 2012 venture capital funding went to energy. Compare that to software, which is almost a third. Now, why do VCs like software? Because software is cheap. You can pretty much form a software company out of a garage. Now, the key challenge I would say with thorium energy is that we have a large, what's called a valley of death. For those of you not familiar with the term, it's used in the startup to refer to the time between your first seed funding and your first receipt of revenue. Granted, this is for the 1972 molten salt breeder reactor, which is the two-fluid reactor. Some designs like David LeBlanc's DMSR cut down on this cost, but I went with this because this has the most detailed cost estimates. There's literally line by line documentation out there of where they were going to spend this money had they received it. And taking all of this and propagating it to 2012 dollars, what I get is a valley of death where you would need an initial financing of $3.2 billion spent over a lifetime of 5 to 10 years. Venture investments are trending at about $25 billion per year. And this is spread across 3,200 companies. Another fact is that the biggest clean energy venture fund, I think it's called Clymer Elmer Perkin, has about $500 million in funds going right now. Which means that taking the total $3.2 billion and dividing by 10 years, we come out at a capitalization rate of 40 times the mean per venture. That's a big honking valley we're looking at. Now, some people have said, well, crowd equity can solve this problem. Unfortunately, in the United States, the Job Act limits crowd equity offerings to less than $1 million per year. So we're not going to be able to fulfill our capital need just by crowd equity alone. It would be nice to have it, but it's not going to nearly fill up that valley. Complicating the issue as well is that the government regulation is really worse than Rip Van Winkle on thorium energy. Rip Van Winkle slept through the American Revolution for 20 years. The US government is looking like it's going to sleep through the thorium revolution for 30 years. That's really what the NRC said. Oh, we're going to get to the regulation and actually hashing out a path for thorium energy in 30 years. And just as an example, the NRC regulations specifically spell out prohibitions against fluid-filled reactors in the regulation. Going there, you can see even for national laboratories, you cannot operate a fluid-filled reactor more than 1 megawatt without expensive license process, running at about $150 per man hour. Now, multiply that by 30 years times the number of manpower the NRC would need to feel comfortable, you could see how that would be prohibitive. Now, just as an example of how prohibitive this is, the trigger reactor makes more than 1 megawatt. This reactor is what's used for students. I don't know, some of you may have seen the YouTube video of the Reed College students operating the trigger reactor. But that reactor that these students operate, these undergraduates, literally sophomores in college, operate more powerful light water reactors than what the NRC will allow national laboratories, which means the NRC trusts sophomores in college. Now, I don't want to knock sophomores in college too much, but they trust sophomores in college more with light water reactors than they do national lab scientists with fluid-fueled reactors. Now, a solution to this valley of death problem that's been advocated is just developing the IP and then licensing it to a big firm. Now, going forward, I'm going to say that I'm going to limit my talk to trying to get thorium in the United States alone, because the situation in the United States is unique in terms of regulation and the industry players. Trying to license this to a big player in the United States is going to be suboptimal. So to get a viable IP, you're going to need to solve the plumbing problem. You need a plumbing solution. This is the graph I got from Timothy Burchell out at Oak Ridge National Lab, which illustrates what the effect of neutron irradiation is on graphite. On the x-axis, on the horizontal axis, you can see the neutron dose, which is pretty much how many neutrons per unit area you get. And on the y-axis, you get the dimensional change. Blue is perpendicular, red is parallel. As you can see, as you irradiate the graphite, it changes in size, which means it springs leaks, or you could have tension and your graphite could crack. In addition, any solution also has to play well with fluorides. This is very important. There are some carbon compounds, which one of my colleagues is going to go into later, that don't play well with fluorides. Without proof of concept, so if you just want to get a nice paper reactor, get a patent on it, and then go to these big industry players and say, here, buy it, that buyer is going to assume all the risks and expenses, including the materials testing. The reason they used to call this at Oak Ridge the chemist's reactor, and that's because materials and chemistry are key to the designs, which means you have to go and you have to heavily test your solution in facilities like the advanced test reactor shown here. Firms speculate in fields they know. This is the investment advice of Warren Buffett and also Peter Lynch, who ran the Magellan Fund. They both say invest in what you know. This limits our field to really one of two candidates. General Electric is one, which they spent some money already on the advanced boiling water reactor shown here in Taiwan. In addition, you could really see what they really think the quote-unquote hot fuel of the future is going to be. Westinghouse is the other candidate, and again, they have invested billions of dollars into their AP1000 reactor. If hypothetically a big company adopts this, knows this field, that has experience bringing reactors to market and experience dealing with the NRC, they're going to cannibalize their profits if they bring this to market. The cannibalized sales are the overlap between what would be the thorium market and the established market. So that overlap is what's called cannibalized. Now, I'm going to actually go into a little bit of options theory here, specifically real options theory, which is used by Boeing to model their R&D process. Pretty much what you can consider is you can consider IP rights to be a call option on, in the United States, 20 years of net revenue. Which, what does that mean to be a call option? That means that if your net expected value of your revenue minus your expenses is positive, then the value of the IP will have a positive value. Otherwise, if the pursuit of your IP turns out to be a loss, your IP has zero value. Now, there's a little bit of other factoring in. You have to do some probabilistic reasoning, but what I've shown here is the value of what's called the expiry, What it means to be at expiry is that's the moment where you have to make a decision whether to pursue and develop the IP or to let it go. Now, due to these cannibalized sales, there's going to be a difference between the value to a big firm and to the value to a startup, assuming that it can be adequately financed to take it directly to market. The reason being is because if a startup successfully develops thorium, they see as gains what they took away from the light water reactors, while the value to the big firm sees that as nothing at all because, oh, we were making money on that market already. So they only see the new markets you open up, while a startup would see all the markets thorium opens up. With no perceived energy crisis due to natural gas, there's no pressure really on the utilities or any other customers to really rush into thorium. Now we can say that there's a long-term crisis, but we've seen in this conference, we've had finance guys come in, and what have they told us? Well, natural gas is cheap. And this here is pictured T. Boone Pickens, who's been a big advocate of that. Without a credible threat of market entry, there's no leverage to negotiate with a big firm. The reason being is because they can wait out the lifetime of your patent. They can lay siege to your patent fortress and just wait for your patents to expire. Which pictured here, this is actually the siege of Candina, which lasted coincidentally 20 years. So what I would say instead, I would say we should imitate the established chemical industry. And what I'm going here is the history as recorded by Alfred Chandler, who was a professor at Harvard Business School. The major companies, Bayer, Aventis, BASF, all started with aniline dye derived from coal tar. Now, how many of you remember my woodcut from before of the Thames River? Part of the reason the Thames River stunk so much is because they would dump coal tar into the river. And so the British were really hard up for solutions of what to do with the coal tar. And eventually, now there's a whole chain of innovators, but eventually a guy named William Perkin, a Brit, invented aniline dye. You would think, well, we know now what was a lucrative market, but unfortunately the British dropped the ball on it, and instead the Germans saw the value of aniline dye, and they gathered up all the chemists, and anyone who knew anything about aniline dye was operating in Germany. BASF even named their company after that. BASF is an acronym for Badisch, Aniline, and Sober Fabric. And you can see the aniline is right there on one of their bonds. Starting out in the initial aniline market, it enabled these chemical companies to establish a learning base that supported further innovation. I mean, the operational capability to go from lab bench to commercial product, as illustrated here by BASF's corporate strategy page off their website. The operational capability to capture value from those products, which includes IP licensing. I'm not totally against IP. I just think you're not going to be able to sell it successfully to a big firm just because there's going to be that differences in valuation. The operational capability to manage mass production. And the organizational capability to understand customers and distribute to them, as this advertises from BASF to automobile manufacturers and the Going Green movement. And finally, my other point is that the cheapest source of capital is retained earnings. Possessing these capabilities in a given field, I would argue, is a superior barrier to entry. So how would I say we develop these capabilities in the thorium community? I would say Actinium-225 and other ancillary technologies can be our aniline dye. Actinium produces short-lived bismuth-213. Bismuth-213 you can create, what Paul Ehrlich described as medicine's magic bullet. What you do, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce this compound, maybe one of my chemical engineers can, but you bond a cancer-targeting antibody, which targets the specific cancer you want to treat, with bismuth-213 and this long, complicated compound. And then what does this antibody do? It's injected into the patient, and it brings the bismuth-213 in close proximity to the cancer. Now what happens is the bismuth-213 gives off alpha radiation. Alpha radiation is very, very special in that it has devastating impact on the nearby cell, but it doesn't travel more than 1 or 2 cells before it collides and explodes, and it doesn't get further than that. The end result is that the cancer is killed with very minimal collateral damage. And for those of you familiar with cancer treatment, the key limitation on how much treatment they can give you is the collateral damage. When you get to the limits of the treatment, the body is literally dying. And what they hope is that the cancer is just dying faster than you are. Based upon some surveys that there's actually an SEC filing on a sale of Actinium-225. This could be a $50 million market by 2014, as estimated by Charles Forsberg when he detailed the uses of, guess what, uranium-233. And we know what the government did with that. It got rid of it. There are alternative ways to produce Actinium-225. One method is we take our beloved element thorium and we hit it with protons. Now, important note, when you're trying to for those of you who want to actually go and try to calculate what the cash flow would be. So the first note is that in the long run, the activities, which is how many decays you're getting per second for each element, each level, since we have branching here, is equal. The other method to produce Actinium-225 is you hit it with neutrons, which coincidentally happens in our reactor. But as I should note, this is ideal as this is a fringe benefit. Because of this long chain and because of the long lifetime of uranium-233, you have to stockpile a large volume of uranium-233, which is regulated as a source term by NRC parlance, which is heavily regulated by the NRC. You have to store a lot of it to produce very little Actinium-225. There's another element which we can use as our feedstock, which is radium-226. And we can also stick radium-226 in a nuclear reactor and get a similar behavior to what we see when we stick thorium-232 into a nuclear reactor. But my favorite reaction pathway is this one, where we take radium-226 and we hit it with a proton, and out comes Actinium-225. Now at this point, you're probably wondering, well, what does this have to do with thorium? The reason I bring this up is because the chemical processes used to separate the Actinium-225 from the radium is identical to the chemical processes we use in molten salt reactors, thus establishing a common chemical base to then further launch our industry. Radium sulfate is also a molten salt, can also be a molten salt. Radium bridges off the shale gas boom, which if you see here, when you look at the produced water, which is very old water that comes out of the wells, they're getting levels of about 1,000 picocuries per liter. And they're paying about 50 cents per liter to dispose of it. Now, in his 2012 State of the Union address, Obama promoted the actinium technology. So we do have political support. And the US regulation for subcritical particle sources, i.e. accelerators and fusion, is much more reasonable than for critical sources. In addition, agreement states such as Joe Sestak's Pennsylvania have a lot more leeway in regulating radium than they do than they do thorium and uranium, in addition to the regulation of accelerators and fusion. So based upon these, I would say it's prudent that the thorium community build bridges with the fusion community. In particular, I have to say that the physics behind the plasmoid, which you see in the reverse field, and the dense plasma focus is very promising. There's actually some effects there that makes them much more competitive than tokamaks. I also think it's prudent that we build bridges with accelerator-driven systems, not just for the radium, but also they can really, really help out with the materials testing. But I have to do this with a caveat. And the caveat is that the gain from the regulatory simplicity must offset the loss from the technical complexity. I have yet to see any of these advocates, when they've come visit us, make this argument that you gain more from the regulation than you do from the additional complexity we would have by introducing this. By building bridges like this, we can overcome obstacles of thorium energy. Now what I have here is, this is the interplanetary superhighway. As you notice, it's a very roundabout route. And the reason this is called the superhighway is because you need the least amount of rocket fuel to get anywhere in the solar system via this way, especially when compared to a direct moonshot, for example.
So when do you see a viable lifter coming on the market?
The financing. So, the thing is, the actinium does help level out the valley of death. It is a bridge, but it produces 50 million a year, so we need to develop additional bridges to get lifter running. The key limitation is not time, but money. So if we could get the $3.2 billion right now, it would take, we could really rush it to 5 years.
I'm wondering if you have considered the impact on the timescales of steadily increasing violence and frequency of violent weather.
Well, we're getting it really outside, a little bit outside, but about the timescale, you really need the government cooperation on that to get a price on carbon. Otherwise, you know, I argued a commercial route. The only way you can get investors to back something, your fiducial duty to investors is really to give them the largest return possible for their money. So you really need government to step in and give you that price signal to then argue reduction of severe weather.
Very good. Thank you, Cavan.